I do a lot of work in prison. I do a lot of nonviolence work, restorative justice work, trauma healing work. And then in the other half of my life, I'm involved in these direct action trainings and getting more and more involved in climate justice work. And sometimes there seems to be a disconnect. Like, what does trauma healing and restorative justice work have to do with nonviolence and direct action work and climate justice? And I want to share a little story to kind of begin to bring that synergy to those two things. A little over a year ago, I met a man named John. John has been in prison since he was 16 years old, about 20 years now. He's currently serving his life sentence in Folsom State Prison in California. And I went and visited him. John is serving a life sentence because when he was 16 years old, he killed a 14-year-old boy. And when I met him, I told him that I'm here to see you because the mother of the 14-year-old boy that you killed wanted me to come meet you because she wants to have a dialogue with you. She reached out to us and says, I'm ready to have some process of healing and reconciliation with the man that took my son's life. And so over the next year, my co-facilitator Bonnie and I started to meet with both Cindy, the mother, and John, the man in the prison, individually for about a year to prepare them for this dialogue. And this past April, we were finally able to bring them together. And it was one of the most healing things I have ever witnessed in my entire life. And this is one of the reasons why I love doing this work. Like, it's such a privilege to do this work in the prisons, because I'm able to witness a depth of healing that I have never seen anywhere else. And it gives me so much faith in what's possible, right? In what we're capable. Like, our resiliency as a species is so much stronger than what we typically think. I remember during the dialogue, we walked into the prison with the mother, Cindy, and we sat her down, and she was a nervous wreck, right? She hasn't seen this man in 20 years. And we sat her down in the room, made sure she was okay, and I went around the corner to the holding tank where John was being held. And when I got to that holding tank, like, John was already in tears and was shaking. And so I put my hand on his shoulder and had a conversation with him. And in my head, I'm like, all right, I gotta try to calm him down and get him ready. And then very quickly I realized, like, that makes no sense. Like, there's no, getting him ready for something like this. So we got up and we stood up and he went around the corner. Ooh, still. He goes around the corner. And the moment he sees the mother, he just completely breaks down. And his body's shaking and there's just tears pouring out of his eyes. And Cindy sees that from the room. And she stands up and just opens his arm. And they meet in this embrace that it felt like it lasted for an hour. And then they ended up talking for 6 hours straight. And there was a moment that I'll never forget where she was holding his hands. She said, I need to hold your hands. And she said that I dreamt that I need to hold your hands because these are the hands that took my son's life. And I need to have a different relationship with them. And then John, they're both native, John and Cindy. So John wears a medicine pouch around his neck. And he said he's been wearing that medicine pouch for the entire 21 years that he's been incarcerated. And he gave that medicine pouch to Cindy as a gift. Which, as a facilitator, was this moment of panic that is technically considered contraband. And we let that go. But I share this story because I've come to believe over the years of doing this kind of trauma healing work in the prisons as well as direct action work on the outside, that change is a fractal thing, right? That what's possible at the smallest scale is possible at the largest scale. that if that depth and that level of healing and forgiveness and accountability and transformation and reconciliation is possible between a man and the mother of the person whose life he took, if that's possible, then healing and reconciliation and transformation and accountability and all of that is possible at the larger scale between nations, between communities, between species, between us and the earth. But if change is fractal, then the same principles that guide transformation at the smallest scale also has to guide our large-scale transformations. When we go into the prisons, we don't go in there shaming people for having committed, I've worked with people who have committed the most atrocious acts of violence you could possibly imagine. And we're not going in there calling them criminals and telling them that they're bad and evil, right? Like, you can't shame people into transformation. If you call people and treat people an animal, they're gonna start acting like animals. And that's the challenge with our criminal justice system is we treat people as if they're less than human and then expect them to be like the highest form of humankind, right? And expect them to be able to hold themselves accountable. And I've actually come to believe that accountability isn't something you can shove down someone's throat, right? Like you can't hold someone accountable as much as you can only hold space for someone to develop their own sense of accountability. And when we talk about holding people accountable, I have a sense that the key word is actually not accountable, but to hold. Like, what does it mean to hold somebody? When you're holding someone accountable, do they actually feel held? And do they feel safe enough to be able to say, yeah, I did that, and I understand the impact that my actions had, and I feel genuine remorse for that? Do they feel safe enough to take full responsibility of their actions and trust that the community is going to hold them and not throw them out of the interwoven web of humanity? Right? Or do they feel attacked? And do they feel shamed? And are they going to get defensive and say, no, I didn't do that. That wasn't on me. Right? I had no part in slavery. That was hundreds of years ago. That I have nothing to do with that. Reparations is another key part of the work of this network. And we're happy to see this like national conversation about reparations starting to happen, right? And a lot of people are saying, well, slavery is something that happened hundreds of years ago. I have nothing to do with that. Because I think a lot of white people are scared to say, if they acknowledge that they benefited from this gross injustice, that somehow they're going to be shamed and thrown out of beloved community. And what we need to do is to create a dialogue where we can actually have the real conversations about the historical harms that have happened and continues to happen in a way that acknowledges that people still benefit from that harm, but they're still always going to be part of beloved community. And to me, that's what fierce vulnerability is, right? Is having the strength to lead with vulnerability and using vulnerability as a way to connect with people, as a way to reach out to people's humanity and to try to begin the transformation of society. I mentioned last night about the shutdown of the Bay Bridge, right? When I think about fierce vulnerability, I think about how can we build a movement that is as militant as that action was, that is not scared to say no, that is not scared to shut down highways and occupy government buildings, because the level of like heightened escalation of violence and injustice that we're seeing in the world today requires like an escalated response, right? Filling out a petition is not good enough anymore. We need to be shutting down highways. We need to be disturbing the complacency and the normalization of violence that is so prevalent in our society. But we need to do it in a way where we acknowledge that when we shut down a highway, that's our attempt at trying to heal the wounds of society. Right? It's like our goal is healing and reconciliation. In a lot of activist cultures today, there's this like culture of like shut it down, we're here to shut it down. But in fierce vulnerability, we acknowledge that even if tactically we're trying to shut down a highway, our true intention is to open things up. How can we use direct action as a way to open up relationship and open up the possibility of transformation and open up the possibility of reconciliation? One of our incarcerated trainers in Soledad Prison, there are teams of nonviolent trainers that we have in prisons throughout California, he said to me one time when we're talking about reconciliation that resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. That oftentimes in our work, we only think so far as to how do we fix the issue. Maybe if we shut down this bridge, we can get enough power to pass this piece of legislation. But that does nothing to heal the relationship between the two parties that were always in conflict. And if we're not trying to repair relationships, then we're always going to be spinning our wheels because we're oftentimes sowing seeds for new conflict as we're resolving this issue right here. So fierce vulnerability is about having the power to fix issues because that is necessary, but also to have the heart and the vulnerability and the softness to begin to repair relationships. One of the things that I've learned over the years of doing this work in the prison is that, that saying that hurt people, right? That like when we're feeling hurt and we don't have healthy releases for that pain, we release it onto somebody else and we hurt other people. And so much of that hurt begins to manifest as shame. And there's a great quote that I believe it comes from Stacey Hines that says that guilt is feeling like I feel bad for something that I did and I know it. Whereas shame is I feel bad for what I am and they know it. Shame is about, it becomes like an identity. I'm a terrible person. I am unworthy. I am unlovable. And she also says that shame derives its power from being unspoken. Right? Shame is the emotion that people are least likely to want to talk about. Speaking to the things that we're most shameful for or ashamed of is one of the hardest things to do. And yet, if we can have the courage and the fierceness and the vulnerability to speak to the things that we're most ashamed of, in community, in relationship, it is incredibly liberating. And I think direct action is something that needs to be utilized as a way to build the leverage to force this conversation, to force this country to speak to its greatest shames. There's a lot of stuff in the history and currently in this country that we should be ashamed of. What is happening at the border today, we should be ashamed of what is happening at the border. What is happening with climate change, just all of these, like we should be ashamed that we're not having the conversation. Maybe at a very surface level. But we need to force our society to have the depth of conversation that is required to go through the level of transformation that we need if we're going to survive another generation. Right? And so, like I said yesterday, I don't know how to do that. Right? Fierce vulnerability is about engaging in that question with all of you. So over these next 2.5 days, we're going to be engaging in that discussion. But what does it look like to balance the fierceness and the vulnerability? I'll just end with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. King, of which I have many. Where he said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic." That a lot of our movements are really good at capturing a lot of power, but it oftentimes happens in the absence of love. Like I said yesterday, even in nonviolent movements, we harness all this power and then use that power to try to dominate the other side. But then a lot of communities, a lot of faith communities, a lot of communities that consider themselves nonviolent are incredibly loving, but don't know how to harness the power for that love to actually lead to systemic transformation. And fierce vulnerability, love and power, it's at that intersection that we believe something different is possible.